What does it mean to be called crazy in a crazy world? Listen to Madness Radio, voices and visions from outside mental health. Welcome to Madness Radio. This is your host, Will Hall. And today my guest is Monica Cassani. Monica is a psychiatric survivor and social worker. She's the creator of the Beyond Meds Everything Matters blog, which she created in 2007. And since then, she has supported thousands of people seeking alternatives to psychiatry. Monica was one of the early creators of internet spaces for psychiatric survivors and psychiatric alternatives. Monica lives with chronic illness and has been focusing recently on the relation between tardive dyskinesia and Lyme disease. So welcome to Madness Radio, Monica Cassani.
Thank you.
It's great. It's great to see you. And as always, we've been friends and colleagues since the 2008, I think it was.
I think that was our first interview. Yeah.
Yeah. So if people there, so this is the second interview I'm doing with Monica. So if people want to check that out, I encourage you to look it up on the Madness Radio website. And I guess probably the first thing we should maybe create a context for this is that you're living with pretty severe, debilitating chronic illness. And so it's been a process for us to create the space and the opportunity to do this interview. And I'm really grateful for you stretching yourself to share with our audience and have a conversation with me. So thanks a lot for being on the show.
Well, outside of it, maybe taking a few times to get started, it doesn't feel like a stretch to talk to you. Not ever.
Great. I'm glad to hear that. We'll try and make the interview not stressful. So Monica, maybe for people who aren't familiar with your work, do you want to say a little bit about the creation of the Beyond Meds Everything Matters blog and the work that you did, I guess, for like 15 years now? That's when the blog was started, 14 years ago, 15 years ago.
Yeah, I think it's 15 at this point. Well, I just started writing really on a whim. I didn't expect anything to come of it. During the very beginnings of, this was before like Facebook and Twitter. Or it was just at the very beginning. I wasn't on Facebook or Twitter, and a lot of people were not. And blogs really were like the first place people started having a lot of conversations. Of course, now they've gone completely out of style, but at that time, that was where the conversations were happening, and that's where all the long threads were happening. And there was a big collection of people, around Philip Dottie's work, Furious Seasons. He was a journalist who wrote fantastic critical work on the pharmaceuticals, and he had a more neutral stance in a general sense, and so he held a container for people all over the spectrum who were interested in psychiatric pharmaceuticals. And so I started finding my voice there among others as we started to discuss these issues.
That was the Furious Seasons blog. I remember that blog. That was really a very influential, very early critical psychiatry
It
blog.
laid the
I don't think it's still around, but
No, it hasn't been there for a long time. I do have some of his archives on my site.
mhm.
He gave me permission to do that. Um,
So that's really where you started to find your voice in terms of sharing with other people about your experience.
yes, I had never discussed these things, although they were part of what I thought about. I had never had a context to develop, language around my concerns because nobody I knew had them, or not the way that I did. And so those early days for me are like romantic in my memory of how, because I was finding myself for the first time, coming off the drugs. I was already coming off when I started reading Furious Seasons, and it took me 6 years to come off, and I'd been coming off 3 years when I started writing.
So how did you get just for people who maybe don't know your story, how did you get a diagnosis? How did you get on the meds? And then how did you start the process of coming off? I know that we went into detail on this in the other interview, but I want to give people a context for your work now.
In college, I was forcibly hospitalized after doing hallucinogens, essentially. And
Like LSD or mushrooms or something?
um, it was, I guess, yeah, both probably. It was a crazy summer. I didn't do drugs much. I did them very, very briefly, and I don't actually consider mushrooms drugs. I consider them herbs. But LSD is a pharmaceutical. I think that qualifies as a drug. Um, I It was a very, very brief stint. I was in college. And yeah, I had a massive, what I perceive now as a massive out of control Kundalini awakening type of event.
So
And
a spiritual emergence
yeah,
breakthrough.
and it was just completely misconstrued by everyone. And I did my damnedest to find other means of support and care at the time. And
So you were doing mushrooms and LSD and something kind of blasted. Kundalini is, it's like a concept from yoga from.
yeah, it's one that's worked for me. It still does. I mean, I use multiple frames to understand my experience. Kundalini remains one of the many multiple frames I use.
Okay, so you do these hallucinogenic drugs, and instead of just having this weird kind of recreational experience, emotional opening experience, something kind of explodes or gets.
Well, it was more complex than that, and I didn't get into it at the first time because I hadn't dealt with the traumas involved. I had a boyfriend who was doing this with me, who ended up traumatizing me grossly and gravely. And I think it was the trauma more than the hallucinogens that hurt me. I was raped. He stole my money and took off. And the trauma was extreme. I loved him. He decimated me and took off. And I ended up in the hospital, and nobody asked me what was going on, what happened. I had lost my first love in a violent and horrible way.
So the role of the trauma connected with the psychedelics, you hadn't really put that together in the previous interview that we did.
No, I mean, I hadn't even really, yeah, I hadn't.
Mm.
I, like everybody else, even while I was talking about trauma, was still learning to understand my own.
I have to say, I first started understanding the role of trauma in my own psychiatric incarceration probably when I was like 28 or 29, maybe 3 or 4 years after, maybe a little bit longer. And I'm still uncovering pieces. I went through a whole school program. I was in a master's degree counseling program, and there was a whole traumatic incident that I never even talked about while I was in the
Mm.
school program, in doing therapy and being in groups and doing all this intense. So trauma really, I think in Buddhism, they talk about the sleeping defilements. When I heard that phrase, sleeping defilements
Well,
that sort of come.
what I did was become a social worker and take care of people with traumas that were similar to my own. While I thought they had it so much worse than me, I finally started realizing that my traumas were pretty much the same as the people I was taking care of. And so there's a whole host of, secondary post-traumatic stress from the people I was working with, because I worked with the fringe of the fringe. But it turns out that my traumas were very similar to theirs. And I had never, we grow up believing, or I did, that I was normal. My family looked normal on the outside. So by the time I was finished working and started talking to others in Philip Dottie's circles, and then my own work where people, traumatized, hurt people started flooding to me, I uh, I started recognizing the same things in my own history.
So there's an element, I guess that's called vicarious
That's the word. Yeah,
re-traumatization.
that's what I
Yeah, where
was
you
looking
get,
for.
yeah, I don't always like clinical terms, but that's
Mhm.
kind of a useful concept. So where does the Kundalini part come in? Because that would suggest that there was something positive about it. And I think this is one of the things about your work and reading your work all this time is that you are on a spiritual journey. And I know that's a cliched phrase that get used a lot, but let's get into that because I think that's very interesting. How trauma, psychedelics, stress, the conflict with a boyfriend, and a spiritual process and Kundalini are all interwoven.
Well, unfortunately, and it's hard to know how to talk about this stuff because I do not have a Pollyanna attitude about it, and people turn these kind of ideas into very Pollyanna type quips. But
Like they take them lightly, or they don't.
yeah, well, I think what happened to me was the only way I was ever going to become an authentic person. My being and self was so squashed. I needed to be destroyed in order to find my authentic self.
You mean
And
before you took the psychedelics and had the violence happen to you, you were already squashed and you needed
I was
something.
completely squashed, and but I was seeking, and that's why I did those things. Those things were done in integrity and seeking truth. And I cannot regret them. There, a lot of people do these things, get psychotic, and then say, "Oh, I would never do that." I certainly don't recommend sensitive people dive into using substances, but I know that had I not done that, I would have gone into a life of being shut down and unaware. And my life sucks. Frankly, it does. And I prefer it to being a walking zombie uh, soldier of capitalism.
Walking zombie soldier of capitalism. Yeah, this I think a lot of people would hopefully question that. Well, that's really that brings us to like your current situation and the struggles that you're dealing with as someone who's struggling with chronic illness. It's a very powerful thing to say. You would prefer being in the suffering that you're,
I'm alive. My life sucks, but I'm alive.
but you're alive. Yeah.
I don't think I was alive when they drugged the shit out of me. I was alive when I started my journey seeking. And yeah, my life is in order to wake up from what had been done to my body since I was a infant, from what I can tell, that was the only way. And I'm still the systemic infections I have that happen to also correspond with Lyme disease in terms of lab results. As far as I can tell, it goes back to infancy because I can feel the stuff coming out when I'm doing Lyme protocols to get the break up and dispel the biofilm that the Lyme disease creates.
Yeah, okay, so a lot of concepts that are new to me, and as we've talked as we've talked before, this has been something like, "Oh, I'm trying to get up to speed," because we're sort of building a bridge between different realities here, and I'm trying to I have
Oh,
not.
my reality, baby.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. Well, so it sounds like in your childhood there was a squashing, like you felt squashed, and I'm imagining that there were things happening in your family that we would associate with trauma or neglect. But there's
Oh yeah,
also,
and I could go on for 3 hours about all of that,
right.
but
Well, I think we talked about it a bit in the previous interview.
I didn't have as much of an understanding as I do now, but maybe a little bit.
Okay, so there's that, but then there's also this kind of physiological, let's call it maybe, I don't know what we could call it, like a physiological injury that has to do with infection and I mean, a lot of us are aware of how antibiotics and gut health and the different things that nutrition, the ways that we grew up, even like something as simple as living a sedentary lifestyle, or the influence of different chemicals in our food and pollution. And there's a lot of research coming out now about air pollution and cognitive problems, behavioral problems, mood problems. So both of those things were going on, and you sort of on some level you knew that you needed to break out because you didn't want to be a capitalist zombie. So you become a seeker, you take psychedelics, and then combined with this trauma and violence that happens with your boyfriend, things sort of explode for you. But it's also this Kundalini awakening. You're in the psych system, you're on meds. Now you're working as a social worker with other people, and you're thinking, oh, wow, they have it so much harder than I do. But actually, at some point, you realize, wow, I'm actually deeply, deeply traumatized as well. Was that the point at which you started to think about coming off the meds, and how long were you on medications for?
Yeah, I mean, that is kind of how it happened. My clients were dying because of the drugs they were taking. I mean, I knew that the medications were killing them, and I knew that I was on actually larger cocktails than almost all my so-called severe and persistently mentally ill clients.
What
Um,
medications were you on, or what was that?
I was on every single class of psych med at the highest dose. Anyway, we talked about that in the past too. So that's why it took so long to come off and why I have iatrogenic injuries. It's become clear to me that the iatrogenic injuries also allowed for grave and gross systemic infections to take over, opportunistic infections. Um, and that's why I haven't recovered from the physical aspects of the drug withdrawal.
So I think of you as being really at the leading edge of a lot of what I guess has been called holistic or functional medicine, and sort of slowly psychiatry, way too slowly, if ever, so psychiatry starts to catch up. And one of the things when we talk about systemic infections and the role that they might play in emotional suffering, psychological suffering, psychosis, is that we sort of like want to push that away because it's too biologically determinist. Like we think, oh, this is something that the physiology is being blamed, where actually this is a trauma. This is a question of support. This is a question of the person's life story, not what is the phrase that gets used? Like it's what happened to you, not what's wrong with you. And I think that's what's really interesting about talking with you and learning from you, is that a lot of those artificial boundaries and separate categories and separate boxes start to get blurred in this way that I think is actually much more promising for understanding what is driving people's suffering.
Well, even before I understood any of my issues to be infection, I was starting to use the term everything matters long before I entitled my work, renamed my work and everything matters. I was using it because it became clear to me before I even knew about the infection. The physical is not separate from the psychological. And we have all these camps. We have the functional medicine doctors who want to say everything's physical, and therefore all you have to do is heal the body and your mind is boom better. And there are quite a few people in the psychiatric system who hate drugs because supposedly they're responding to a physiological need. But the criticism of that is right, because they're hurting people more. But there is a physiological need that's there nonetheless, in tandem with the psychological need and the societal need and the environmental needs and the financial needs, and everything matters is literal everything.
Right. So the example I was thinking of is like gut health, that there's been so much that's coming out just over the past 5-10 years, that actually the nutrition, the food that you eat, and the impact on the flora, the microbiome of your body, of different kinds of injuries from different toxins in your environment, to foods, nutritional habits, pharmaceutical drugs can affect the microbiome. And then that has a direct impact on your cognitive state, your neurological health, your mood. And this role that the physiology can play doesn't have to be a determinist either it's trauma and psychological conflict, or it's physiological determinism. Actually, all these things can be playing a role. I mean, it kind of blew my mind because for so many years I had heard about serotonin. Like, okay, serotonin is this chemical in your brain that is a messenger. And I have this very sort of crude cartoon concept of this sort of like steam engine machinery, or the circuitry of the computer like brain. But instead of electricity going through, or maybe there's electricity going through, but there's also this juice that's bouncing around called serotonin. And then I learned that, well, actually serotonin is throughout your entire body, that there's a lot of serotonin in your gut. And people say, oh, well, I made a decision from my gut, or that really, I heard the news and it was like a punch in the gut. And we have so much of an embodied common sense relationship with our gut as a place of knowing. And then here's something, sure enough, in science and medicine that starts to confirm that or relate to that or suggest connections with that in really intriguing ways. And then I learned that serotonin is actually widely found in nature. It's actually a part of the natural world. And then I'm thinking, okay, I've been reading and learning about quantum physics and the idea of everything's connected through hello. Actually, if you go deep enough into biology, the biological sciences are discovering the way in which things are deeply, deeply interconnected. So when you say infections, I don't think of psychiatric drug harm as being related to infections. I think of like, oh, someone, if you take mercury, mercury is a very poisonous substance. So in very, 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 very tiny doses, it'll have this corrosive kind of effect on your brain and your body. And so all pharmaceuticals that are toxic at some level have this kind of corrosive sort of toxic pollution effect on your brain and body. But that to me, how does that relate to infection? I wasn't sure I understood that until I started to read your understanding
Okay. Biofilms are created by whatever's living in you, the microorganisms.
of which there are like millions or billions.
We are more microorganism than we are human if you want to think about individual to individual. I mean, there are
Right.
trillions of microorganisms in us, and on us, and they're everywhere. The microbiome is not just in your gut; it's everywhere. And to call the
The air you breathe, the water that you drink,
right,
the food is covered with bacteria and microorganisms that create this whole complicated so human so to say that we aren't separate individuals isn't just a spiritual belief, it's
we're
actually biologically true. We're ensembles.
we're literally different universes. It could even be argued that we serve as planets to all these beings living on us and in us. And I actually have an experience of that. I have a sense of knowing different species that live in and on and throughout me.
Well, that's intriguing. Definitely want to get into that.
Also, I've come to understand that our consciousness, it's not just the food we eat, it's our consciousness is actually determined, not just influenced, but to some extent determined. But it's going to be kaleidoscopic because we all have different colonies and populations of microorganisms. So it's going to be endlessly diverse, but it is determined by that diversity of microorganisms that we house. They affect our consciousness.
So how does this relate to psychiatric drug injury?
Well, psychiatric drugs, in my experience, destroyed or continued to destroy it. I think the sensitivity to being wide open can sometimes be a challenged blood brain barrier. The drugs seem to make these issues worse and allow infection to enter and take over. The drugs have nanoparticles as well as all sorts of chemical substances that the biofilm that these microorganisms, the ones that cause the infections, collect and form into structures in the body that disturb all sorts of things, organ systems. My clients were dying for those reasons. Organs shut down, detoxification, impossible. They call that metabolic syndromes. People who get diabetes and die and gain 300 pounds from Zyprexa, and all the antipsychotics can do that.
Right. These are systemic stresses that lead to systemic breakdowns. I mean, the idea of the blood brain barrier, that really, a light bulb really went off when I talked with you about this, because we know from, in terms of gut health, like restoring my gut has been really important. Like I stopped eating sugar. I started to look at like fungus buildup in my body. I started to eat a much more healthy diet. And apparently like something can happen called leaky gut syndrome. Whereas if
Blood-brain
you,
barrier problems or leaky brain. I think you're the one who said that. I loved it when you said that to me.
yeah, well, it really, it made a lot of sense. So you have the situation where the barriers in your gut are corroded or undermined by this nutritional imbalance, which is basically the microorganisms, the biome is like wildly out of balance, sort of like a lake that's overflowing with algae because of there's too much nitrogen flowing into it from agricultural runoff. And so the balance of the algae and the ecosystem of the lake is sort of thrown off. So you have this overgrowth and undergrowth, and then that is affecting the barrier of the blood and the stomach, and then you start to have this kind of contamination that's happening. And so what you're saying, if I understand it, is that something is happening in the brain as well, that the barrier between the brain and the blood system gets weakened and undermined. And then now you have opportunistic infections that come in. So now we have a very clear, as I understand it, pathway of psychiatric drug harm leading to infection. Am I following this correctly?
Yes, but it goes a little further than that in my own somatic experience, because
Hmm.
the mouth, in terms of, most medical thought around the gut when they consider it as a whole, the mouth is the entrance to the gastrointestinal system. But the mouth is right there next to the brain, and the sinuses collect things from the mouth, and the sinuses go into the brain. Basically, your gut and your brain, it's your gut's not a second brain, it's part of the brain. And I was sick for so long. I was inert, I was bedridden. I couldn't even sit upright. I was literally just propping my head up, but I was still laying flat for 5 years.
5 years. Yeah.
So,
I
my,
remember visiting you during that period.
yeah.
You weren't able to have a conversation like we're having now, or your energy levels and your level of impairment was so severe that we wouldn't have been able to communicate like this.
No, I mean, very occasionally I could have a conversation, but mostly I really couldn't speak at all. And there were times, and you never saw me then, where I mean, I literally was just in a dark room and couldn't do anything. But when I was laying down, people don't understand this about chronic illness, what happens to the body. But if you're laying down all the time, you're not digesting correctly, and food and bile and everything literally travels up to your brain, so that infection, the stuff in your gut should not be reaching your brain. But if you're inert for 5 years and you don't move, and you don't have a physical therapist coming in moving your body around or anything, shit happens. I mean, big time. And that's another one of my interests now, is helping people who've been bedridden or critically ill for a really long time understand what it means to have had a frozen inert body, and how do you come back from that, because it's just not understood by virtually anyone in the medical field.
So I'm having that experience like we're in different realities. I can kind of relate to what you're saying. I mean, I made these connections, but I've never been diagnosed with Lyme disease, for example. I don't have the outward expressions of tardive dyskinesia, although I do notice in my life that after I took antipsychotics, I guess I was on antipsychotics for about 2 years or a year and a half. I'm grateful that I wasn't on longer than that, but I noticed that there were cognitive changes. I think it changed my whole body being on those. I can't track it. I don't have like the baseline. I don't have like the whole, it's all complicated. There's lots of different pieces to the puzzle, but I can kind of bridge to your reality. But what you're trying to do is you mentioned the word somatic, you're trying to connect what you are experientially observing, because I know you a long time meditator. You're trying to connect what you're experientially observing with your frameworks, scientific research frameworks, holistic health frameworks for saying what is going on with me through, because I know you've been experimenting and trying like everything.
Well, that's not true. I've only been able to try things within my very limited resources, and
Yes. Yeah.
medical care is not available to most of us, including myself. I don't do hardly any conventional medicine for Lyme because I cannot afford it and insurance doesn't cover it. So everything I have done has been low tech, low cost, and do it yourself.
Do it yourself in the sense of you've trusted yourself in this kind of trial and error experimental process because the doctors really failed you. I mean, even just like a few years ago, Lyme was considered, oh, this is malingering, this is like a psychosomatic thing that people are making up. And now it's actually recognized that, whoa, wait a second, Lyme, fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue syndrome, these are actually real illnesses that people are going through. People aren't just crazy to report that they can't get out of bed, or they have extreme fatigue, or they have extreme brain fog, etc. So tell us about Lyme disease and how that connects with all this.
Okay, first of all, Lyme disease is still considered a highly controversial, and it's still in especially psychiatric circles considered a delusional process. So, because I spent a lot of time in chronic illness circles, everybody in those circles are gaslit by medical professionals to an extreme, and their trauma around that is very similar to those of us who've been psychiatrized actively, and all of them have a taste of it. They relate, a lot of them. I mean, it varies, but a lot of them have actually been psychiatrized because of their Lyme disease. I mean, I actually had to go to the emergency room and tell them that I had Lyme and tardive dyskinesia, and I needed assistance for the Lyme, and they stuck me in the psych ward. That was the last time I was hospitalized last year. The- So basically, people with Lyme disease get thrown into psych wards with some frequency, and because it's not believed.
Yeah, it's true
And
of any kind of physical pain or discomfort or symptom or physical illness in general. As soon as they have any indication that you might have a diagnosis, a psychiatric diagnosis, or they see you in that way, like people get dismissed, they get completely ignored, and people are dying as a result of this.
in conventional medicine, it's still routine to assume that they don't know how to help people. Doctors don't like being helpless. So the best way to not feel helpless is to create blame. It's in their head, and it's not my job to take care of them and send them off to the psychiatrist. So yeah, it's basically a lot of us are there's a huge crossover population among those who have systemic infections and those who are diagnosed with psychiatric issues.
That's a very powerful thing that you said, that doctors don't like to feel helpless. And it makes me think about just the chronic illness, the sort of stigma or the taboo or the sort of very weird psychological banishment that happens around people who have chronic illness may have something to do with people around them, around us, feeling they're helpless. They don't know what to, so it's easier to blame or to ostracize or to try and control or dominate.
All those traumas are common among Lyme and serious chronic illness populations, and I've now hung out with people online, but I get to know them, and there's just lots and lots of crossover traumas among people who have severe chronic illness and those who've been psychiatrized.
Yeah, you go in, you have a complaint about a physical illness, you've looked it up online, you think something might be going on, boom, they put you on an antidepressant. And then now you start down the rabbit hole that we say of like the side effects and now more meds for the side effects. And then
And none of your symptoms are taken seriously in both groups. So anyway, it's very similar, and sometimes it's the same population with different diagnoses depending on which doctor they are unlucky to come to or lucky to, as the case may be.
so tell us more about the relationship of Lyme to the psychiatric drug injury and tardive dyskinesia. Like how do those things fit together with the idea of systemic infections?
Before I knew I had tardive dyskinesia, I was already detoxing for Lyme, and it was obvious to me when the movement started that it was part of the detox, that I was moving out.
The mouth movements and the kind of jaw
Well,
and
even
lip
before
stuff.
that, the jerking movements was, trauma tremors, like trauma release exercises where it causes tremors.
Mm-hmm.
That's related to tardive dyskinesia, except those are done consciously and with a body that's not as toxic. When you become really toxic, the body jerks and wants to get the crap out and wants to open pathways, and the mouth moves and sucks and pulls crap that's living in your face.
It's really interesting because there's also in yoga, there's this idea of the kriyas, that there can be spontaneous
Same
jerking
thing.
and movement that are,
Absolutely.
and of course, like body workers understand that the jaw is often an incredible site of very strong emotional holding and tension. And so it's all kind of related.
Yep, Kriyas are related, trauma release exercises are related. They're all the same thing in people who are tolerating toxicity or, imbalanced microbiomes, however you want to frame it. And it's framed in a lot of different disciplines and in different ways, but it's pointing to the same phenomena.
But how are you so sure? I mean, this is your own
I mean, it's my experience, and
yeah.
I learned critical pieces to get better in each of these groups of people. But nobody's put it all together. I just see the crossover, I leave and do my thing because they can't handle everything else I'm going through. But they're all pieces, and people in different conditions and different contexts of life do better in different frameworks. I've had to use as many as I can find, essentially.
Well, if someone does have the framework of systemic infection, how does it help them? Like, does it lead to different kinds of treatments? I mean, it sounds like that's been true for you, that over the past year, you've actually started to get some treatments that are starting to move you forward after a long time of not moving forward. Is that right? Or
Yeah, but I also don't think everybody needs what I've needed. Everyone's unique in that kaleidoscopic way I talk about. So some people may only need Kundalini yoga or trauma release exercises or talking therapy for that matter. I mean, when we affect one part of the system, the whole system changes and responds. We just might not connect it in the most direct way if we're not super conscious of it all and thinking about it.
yeah, this is where my own reality is kind of playing catch up with yours, because I'm thinking, wait a second, how are systemic infections related to yoga, and how do you treat that with trauma? And then I'm thinking about, well, wait a second, the whole concept of the immune system puts all these different pieces together. So why wouldn't it also affect systemic infection? Is that right?
Yeah, and you don't have to even know about infections if you're doing the right things to treat them and heal them. So if you have a very active life and so you're detoxing through your physical and you join a yoga studio and they teach you how to eat better and you're changing everything including your microbiome. It doesn't always have to be framed as an infection. It may be framed as just imbalance and not feeling healthy, so you make changes. And I don't think it's necessary for a lot of people to ever frame it that way, but it's good to know that that could be part of the picture when someone responds to changing their entire life and diet and activity. That's going to alter things like infection if it's not gone too far. I mean, biofilm, I was on these drugs and things that changed my body in profound ways for many, many years. In detox circles, they often say that if you've been on pharmaceuticals for many years, you may not make it. I am categorized in those groups, and it has shown up to be true. They also don't want to deal with people like me. People like me get shunned in every healing circle because we simply flabbergast everybody. So we're left on our own. And I've met lots of people who've had to do that for different reasons. People that just don't respond to whatever it is that healing discipline's shtick is. And that's the problem is they all have their shtick and they're not willing to go beyond their shtick. And a lot of people with really complex illness need a lot of shticks put together. And this is where we run into problems because it's really hard. I understood this long before I even knew I had an infection. I was talking about kaleidoscopic care, smorgasbord options for
Yes,
treatment. I mean, I
yes,
was
yes.
using this language before I understood how critically important it was for me because some part of me already knew, some deeper knowing part. And then it's just turned out more and more and more to be what I've needed. So I was advocating for the most vulnerable from the beginning because I'm one of those people.
There's such a brutal stereotype or stigma that you can't actually offer people lots of different options because, well, they're going to take advantage, they're going to use too many resources, they're going to be coddled, we don't want to enable them. But this is just part of the incredible bigotry, because the idea is that people are just like these needy consumers who are just going to pull as much as they can, where actually when people start to thrive and they start to connect, they want to give back. No one wants to be in that role. And I think that doctors or therapists, they may have some experience where they see someone as just a taker, and then they get into this kind of punishment or deprivation framework where you can't actually offer something like a smorgasbord to enrich someone's life, because then that's going to be indulging them or positively reinforcing their sick role, or all these different sort of dehumanizing frameworks that people bring in. But I see it as the other direction. Actually, if you give people lots of resources and lots of options, that's when they're going to thrive. Then they'll be able to offer something back. They start to feel like you're actually connecting with them, and they have a valued place in the society. And then my mind goes to the conversations about universal basic income, which is a huge conversation. I don't want to derail us too much, but it turns out that if you give people the resources they need, actually a lot of them, most of them, the vast majority, will become generous and creative and resourceful and want to contribute and give back. And so why not have a more caring, open, generous attitude rather than seeing people in this very punishment, deprivation sort of way that we often do, especially people around chronic illness, because they're seen as like just constant takers, and we don't want to give them too much because they're just going to keep going, and it's going to give them an inch, they'll take a mile, and all this sort of very, very narrow, harsh sort of attitude that is developed.
Yeah.
But to bring it back to what I was saying before, like when I hear the word infection, it's very interesting because I immediately go to like zombie films. Like the infection is the germ, and the germ broke through the door, and you got to beat it up with penicillin, or you got to hit it with the vaccine, or you got to, and then get it out the door. And actually, that's a very militaristic kind of individualism, almost like property. Who violated your property boundary? The trespassers model that we have from zombie films. And there is a germ theory, but there's also like the idea of a terrain theory, that actually if the terrain itself, if the broader context becomes weakened or out of balance, it creates vulnerabilities. And then the germs that come in are opportunistic. But if you focus on fighting the germs and don't see how the terrain, the context was weakened, we understand this from the idea of the immune system and immune health. And I think it's maybe a larger paradigm that needs to be brought in. The presence of germs or the presence of an infection may not mean we have to fight that microorganism. It may mean that the system as a whole has been weakened and vulnerable by something like poor nutrition or poor hygiene, or the breakdown of social connection, or the lack of a role of contribution in the society.
That's why holistic approaches are important, because it's really not about killing everything off, which is what people with infections do start feeling. And there isn't a time and place for that. If you have a biofilm that's taken over your whole body, there is a time and place for that. Ultimately, it's just about coming into balance. Most healthy people have a good number of these microorganisms living inside of them. It's not about all or nothing. It's about not being taken over by the wrong ones in the wrong parts of our bodies. It's not so much about not having them in our bodies at all. Candida, for example, that everybody knows about, is in everybody's gut,
The fungus
but it's
infection,
also a
candida.
normal part of the gut, and everybody has it no matter what their condition is. So I think in terms of that with everything, but basically how serious these infections are is determined functionally. I mean, if they take over your life, and these are not imaginary conditions, and it's a spectrum situation, and all these different factors do come into play. And you don't some people can get these things taken care of without any pharmaceuticals, and I've seen that happen a lot. I've also had doctors tell me you cannot get better if you don't take pharmaceuticals. It's like, excuse me, I know people who have. And so there just simply isn't an all or nothing story about any of these conditions. They're contextual, individual, environmental, and I mean, they're just endlessly diverse. Ultimately, you just have to take people seriously. People don't make up, they just don't. I mean, I'm sure it's been done, but it's not the norm.
Including that it's not necessarily a physical response. It may be a relationship response because we know that situations of oppression or stress or disempowerment impact the immune system. So why wouldn't that also be playing a role in what you're talking about, the systemic relationship to infection? Because I'm not hearing that you're reducing things to what herb are you taking or what supplement are you taking.
No, not at all. I've never done anything the way you're supposed to in Lyme circles or psychiatric circles or anywhere, because for me, oh, I've always rotated everything, and doctors won't work with me hardly ever because I won't do what they tell me because my body rejects their pharmaceuticals after a while. I have taken some antibiotics and antiparasitical pharmaceuticals that have been helpful, but I did not take them the way they wanted me to take them.
But I was also talking about like what we might call psychological or interpersonal or social pathways, like standing up to bullies or
Those things change your body. The chemicals that are released when you do something empowering change your body. They're probably antibiotic. I mean, so absolutely. And if you're isolated like I am and a lot of people are, especially since the pandemic, we don't have relationships to interact with and heal within. You can't heal in isolation. We need each other. So that gets very complex too. We need the drama of the family. We hope that we have conscious parents and siblings, but we need all that. We need the chemicals that are emitted when we feel. And if all we feel is isolated, alone, and sad, well, that's what I live somewhere where I don't know a single person except my partner, who I am very blessed to have. But it's been horrible, and we're trying to get back to where we consider home. But um, it really it's really made me understand. And I was isolated and didn't see people all that much for a long time because I've been sick, but I had people in my life, and I haven't for the last 3 years. And it's phenomenal what I've learned. I mean, I hope to end this, and it will just be another period of my life in which I learn a lot about being human, but it's hard.
well, let's talk about that a little bit because you said that you needed that kind of breakthrough to get you out of this squashed state that was leading you to being a capitalist zombie. And but there's some way that what you've been going through is also a spiritual process. What have you learned, or how is it a spiritual process? Has it had a purpose? Is this happening for a reason?
Well, everything's paradoxical in my life. So, sure, maybe I needed it, but wouldn't it have been nice if we lived in a society that provided options that made it so we didn't have that be the only way to find something? I may make a statement, but there's an opposite that's true always, because everything I experience at this point feels paradoxical. So, I can say one thing in one context and something that sounds like the opposite in another context, and they're both true. And um, that's like a thing to consider in your next Zen meditation.
How has the chronic illness that you've been through helped you or pushed you into that seeing paradox state? Because that's a very spiritual perspective. That's like a non-dual perspective. That's the perspective of Zen or Taoism or a lot of kind of Western mystical traditions.
I've lived in hell for going on 2 decades, and I have access to heaven here, down here in hell. And I've learned that it's just all held together at once. But my body, because it's sick, it doesn't have access to heaven all that often, but it's here all the time. Our bodies and the condition of our bodies allow or disallow what we understand, see, our attitudes. We don't have so much choice, but if we stay aware, we can move in the direction of having it more often. This is why I don't judge people in any ultimate sense. Or people I want to stay the heck away from because my drama and their drama don't mesh. But I know that they're as innocent as I am. Honestly, when I'm in these, I mean, I'm in a flow with you, and I can't, I really don't know what I think of how it's going. It's going, and I'm in the moment. That's good enough for me as far as I'm concerned.
So I'm thinking about something you and I have talked about quite a bit about what is consciousness, and it seems like we're not unified. There's multiple things going on. This is why I'm drawn to Jungian psychology. It's one of the reasons I'm drawn to open dialogue, the idea of that there's different parts or different voices or different perspectives that interact, and through that dialogue the self is created, and we all have this sense of we observe ourselves, or we have a conscience, or we deliberate, we feel conflicts between parts of ourselves. Why is it that the psyche is multiple? And then you and I have talked about, well, we're actually ensembles, we're physiological gathering places of vastly complicated ecosystems of microorganisms, even our physical organs like our liver and our kidney and our lungs. It's almost like they're beings that have their own sort of processes and agenda and things, intelligence that they want to convey to us. People have physical memory, they have body knowledge. You sometimes can't remember something until you put your body into the posture or the position that will trigger that memory. And it seems like it's certainly possible that all of that is interacting with microorganisms. And you've said to me that these creatures inside of your body are talking to you, are that sometimes they're wiser than you. And there's actually a lot of research coming out that bacteria may have some kind of consciousness. May have some kind of intelligent process, that trees are interacting and have consciousness, and they're social and they're communicating with each other. So is
Mushrooms, mycelium.
mycelium, yeah. So is that your experience, that you have this community of beings inside of you that you're
Yes,
talking with?
I've tweeted something like we are a concert of multiple beings. I don't think I can't even consider my experience as human, being human, and my consciousness is separate from the microorganisms that influence the way I think and feel. And the healing process with Lyme is cutting through biofilm, and it brings me directly into the chemistry of traumas that I had as a child. And healing has used foods from childhood to break down even parts of the biofilm. Food as medicine. I suspect I am moving into what will be my life in moderation with food. And I've had to use a lot of substances. I've used all manner of pharmaceuticals and herbs and soft pharmaceuticals, which is what I call a lot of supplements, as well as things like mushrooms and marijuana. I've stayed away almost entirely from pharmaceuticals once I got off of psychiatric drugs, except for a short stint of antibiotics and antiparasites to deal with the Lyme. But all those things, well, they're all conscious beings. I mean, I don't find pharmaceuticals to have consciousness I want to engage in. That includes soft pharmaceuticals of supplements, but herbs, including marijuana and mushrooms, have consciousness, and they will interact with you and tell you how to help you heal.
Help us understand that for people who may not have ever experienced that. I can relate to that, but what do you mean they interact with you and then?
I've had ally plants that pull me off the freeway until I'm parked in front of them. I get out of the car and there it is. They come pick me, Monica. And yeah, I'm in constant relationship with certain plants, and I mean where it's a conscious friendship of sorts. And then others, and food especially, just feels like it all has consciousness and helps me heal and helps me dive into traumas. I mean, I do a lot of trauma work all by myself by diving into the biofilm that holds the crud of my traumas. That's how the traumas and infections are the same.
How do you mean I do trauma work by diving into the biofilm that holds the infection of my trauma?
That's what detox is. The stuff comes up and out. And yeah, I feel the consciousness of the crud that's leaving my body when I'm breaking up the biofilms that are making up the infection that
I'm thinking about like food and substance addiction that people often, and I've had this experience, that that cigarette is talking to you. It's saying, "Hey, come and smoke me." There's an actual organism it's a consciousness that's coming after you that wants to be fed by having you ingest it.
I've used tobacco as medicine since I quit smoking as an addiction, for brief periods because it did help me move some of the crud out. I was lucky to have a teacher, Stephen Buhner, who is a herbalist who recently died, a master herbalist, wonderful man. I've never met him, but he was a teacher in that I read his work, and his spirit was imbued in that, in his work. And one of the things he said was, before you fast, and I'm a proponent of fasting as well, before you fast, you may have to eat everything, every damn thing you crave. Just eat it and do it mindfully. I also took a course in college with healthy at every size, and it was the same thing. Eat whatever you want, just do it mindfully. And so that's what I started doing. So I did a stint of smoking. I've drank Slurpees and Diet Cokes. We're talking very, very occasionally, and these weren't even always cravings. The Diet Coke was like, something told me, drink it, you're gonna come to understand something. I was like, yuck, I didn't even want to. It was an aversion. This is where aversion attachment is the same thing in addiction. So the aversion, I mean, what's one Diet Coke? It's not going to hurt me, but we get so hyper healthy that we are afraid of doing things like that. Well, the Diet Coke helped me. It also made me sick in a way, but it allowed me to understand and develop a new way of being. So it was therapeutic.
How did it do that? How did Diet Coke teach you a new way of being?
Well, there's a lot of things going in. The phosphoric acid is a solvent. It actually helped cleanse some of the gunk that is in my mouth. Tardive dyskinesia, a lot of gunk ends up in your mouth. This is true of everybody with tardive dyskinesia, but somehow, no, it's not an infection. Just use oil pulling to deal with those sores. Well, what do you think the sores are?
So there's sores that are associated with tardive dyskinesia.
There can be.
I think you were saying at some point that you were talking about drinking phosphoric acid.
Phosphoric acid is a solvent. It helped move out some of the gunk. Now, the aspartame in Diet Coke actually is a neurotoxin, and it also moved something in the biofilm and helped me understand the phenomena that got labeled mania. But it worked, I think, kind of as a homeopathic, because it did move some of the stuff. I mean, I don't know. I don't know what's happening. These are intuitive processes, and I can feel changes in my body. And then there's a psychological aha that goes along with it. I mean, I don't have a laboratory to figure out what's actually happening on every level.
But you have a deep trust of your own experience of your body and your consciousness, and that's your guidepost. That's fundamentally your guidepost.
And I have a scientific process of experimentation, elimination, hypotheses that happens again and again and again. So
So you're kind of like a modern alchemist, really.
absolutely, it is alchemy. It's precisely alchemy with some frequency. Anyway, Stephen Buhner, healthy at every size, and then I ran into a somatic therapist friend person that I knew in Asheville. She was fantastic, and she said it was normal that when people were going through radical detoxes, they might eat or drink anything. And it was for her too, what she had seen in her own life and clients, things that people had had attachments to at one time or another. But for me, it's not just the attachment, not just the addiction, it's how the chemical crap in those products form and interact with the microbiome and form the biofilm. Biofilm holds biotoxins, and this is understood pretty much across the board. Heavy metals, I mean, even in conventional medicine, there's a little bit of understanding. Not conventional medicine, conventional science. Medicine doesn't know anything, conventional medicine, but there's heavy metals, there's all sorts of environmental toxins from the air and the water and pharmaceuticals. Red dye and blue dye and other chemicals are associated with behaviors that get labeled things like ADHD in children or OCD, things like that. So all these substances are very significant, and I have a very clean diet in general, and did for many, many years before I reintroduced some of these things now and then as part of my therapeutic understanding of my history when I actually ingested these things.
Yeah, it's a very interesting practice as a meditator to think about, okay, these are the things that I prohibit. These are the things that I'm averse to. These are the things that I avoid because I have a rigid, live the right kind of lifestyle view. Try them. Take a step towards them as an experiment and see what's going on. Like,
That's right.
is there a psychological association that you're avoiding? Is there some lesson that do you want to listen to? Because I mean, I think that the danger, of course, in so much of this is a kind of hyper individualist ascetic purity. It's like it's puritanism. You have to kind of do the right path, and then you will be saved. And actually, it's a little bit more complicated than that. Also, I'm remembering something that you said about dyskinesia, which was very interesting to me, about how dyskinesia appears in other areas of medicine, that people have dyskinesia. It's not just psychiatry. That one of the things that we do often in the mental health discussions is we put boxes around things and we only think about them in the psychiatric mental health context. I mean, I've learned about coming off medications. There's a lot of that's been written, researched, and experienced around coming off all kinds of different medications. There's a huge discussion in the epilepsy world about living with seizures without taking epilepsy meds. And hello, a lot of the things that they're learning and they're exploring are very parallel
Mhm.
to people with bipolar or psychosis or schizophrenia diagnosis. So help us understand that piece about the dyskinesia being something that is more than we might usually think of it as.
This really finally allowed me to start trying to have this conversation publicly was when I learned that dyskinesias were generally outside of psychiatry associated with infection and oxidative stress. And so tardive dyskinesia, the word tardive just means delayed, and it's used only to describe the fact that it's delayed after use of meds. Other than that, dyskinesia looks the same. Yeah.
Well, that's why I think talking to you is such an interesting experience, because it is really a bridging of realities. Like you're living in a different reality than I think vast majority of other people are, in a sense. I mean, we're all living in isolated realities in a sense, but in order to understand where you're coming from, I have to kind of build these bridges back to my own, because I think we all sort of carry around these very simplistic thumbnail sketches of our own health and our own needs and our own sort of understanding of what our body is. And then we sort of, for most of it, it's just like fueling the tank of a car, or eating right because it's sort of a moral injunction to be healthy, or we certain kinds of things are associated with fear, or we have had past experiences with certain foods that we want to repeat. But you've gone very deeply into your own universe of experience by necessity because of the extreme suffering that you've been through.
Well, I coined that term somatic imperative. My process has always been a response to my somatic condition. And it's been imperative that I do the things that I do. And I do it mindfully and try to keep myself out of trouble in that way. But I do what I have to do, and I'm aware of it, given the limitations and resources of this existence in this life in the context I find myself in, which is one in which there's a lot of things I don't have that I think might actually help.
Monica, if people want to get in touch with you and find out more about your work, how do they do that?
Everything matters. I'm not a doctor and I don't play one on TV. That's the subtitle right now. I was being silly, but I've left it there. And it's beyondmeds.com. I'm not writing much right now. I'm living a pretty interior life for the time being.
Monica Cassani, thank you for joining us today on Madness Radio. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure, Will.
You've been listening to an interview with Monica Cassani. Monica is a psychiatric survivor and social worker. She's the creator of the Beyond Meds Everything Matters blog, which she created in 2007 and which has supported thousands of people seeking alternatives to psychiatry. Monica lives with chronic illness and has been focusing on the relationship between tardive dyskinesia and Lyme disease. That's all the time we have on Madness Radio. Thanks for tuning in. What does it mean to be called crazy in a crazy world? Listen to Madness Radio, voices and visions from outside mental health.